Dawn, 17th of August 1944, east of Falaise, the mist clung low to hedgerows, and the air carried the damp sweetness of wet hay over a bitter trace of last night's powder smoke. A faint tremor came first, then a layered murmur that thickened until it pressed on the eardrums like weather. German field officers raised Zeiss glasses and watched the fields themselves begin to move. Olive-drab shapes sliding out of the haze. Sherman after Sherman, glacis plates beaded with dew, turret rings, catching the first light like a slow, metallic tide. A signals sergeant hunched in a slit trench struggled to frame what he saw in numbers. Hundreds. Thousands. And his pencil broke. Veterans who had learned to read the rhythm of an attack heard none. This was not the sprinting violence of blitzkrieg, but an indifferent mechanism breathing forward. Even the smell announced it. Hot oil, gasoline. Damp earth churned into paste beneath steel shoes. By mid-morning, 2 Luftwaffe scouts clawed through ragged cloud and peered down along the roads from Caen and Troon. There was no spear point to strike. Only depth without end, fuel bowsers tucked behind hedges, ammunition echelons snaking east, wreckers and bridging trucks threading between ranks of fresh tanks that replaced the ones already ahead. Staff estimates groped for a size and found a source instead. By the summer of 1944, the United States had already built over 25,000 M4 Shermans, with totals climbing toward 49,000 by war's end. When one burned, another waited at Cherbourg. And behind Cherbourg stood Baltimore's piers. And behind the piers, the presses of Detroit Arsenal, Pressed Steel Car, Fisher Body, Alco, factories that had learned to stamp war the way they once stamped automobiles. A German officer later wrote that the sound that morning was the future arriving, and as the columns thickened toward the Seine, the realization hardened. They were no longer fighting a single army, but a production line that did not sleep. The hum rolling east from Normandy was the proof, and to understand why it never faltered, the story must leave these hedgerows and step into the furnaces and stamping halls where those columns were born. Autumn 1939. Detroit's skyline stood beneath a gray lid of smoke that rose only in faint, uncertain threads. The assembly lines that had once thundered with Model A engines now sat in half-light, their belts idle, the metallic scent of oil and rust hanging in the cold air. Across America, factories slept, the ghosts of the Great Depression still haunting every shuttered plant. In Cleveland, Toledo, and Pittsburgh, men with calloused hands lined up outside gates that never opened. When Hitler's armies tore into Poland that September, the United States could count barely 400 serviceable tanks, most of them thin-skinned M2 light models, more suited to parades than war. The arsenal of democracy did not yet exist. It had to be imagined first. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's words in December 1940, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," were more than a rallying cry. They were a challenge to awaken a sleeping giant of industry. Within months, names once stamped on chrome and fenders, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, were welded to blueprints for tanks, aircraft engines, and guns. The newly created War Production Board became the conductor of this industrial symphony, assigning quotas for steel, copper, rubber, and oil with mathematical precision. Conveyor belts that had once delivered windshields now carried armor plates. Women in coveralls learned to rivet, weld, and operate stamping presses that thundered day and night. By 1942, the transformation was total. Detroit's River Rouge plant rolled out tanks by the hour, while Pittsburgh's furnaces fed the endless hunger for armor steel. Small towns like Flint and Evansville pulsed to the rhythm of shift sirens, their nights glowing orange from foundries that never slept. America's economy had turned itself into a battlefield, each welder, machinist, and riveter a soldier without a rifle. The numbers defied imagination. By 1945, U.S. factories had built over 88,000 tanks, nearly 300,000 aircraft, and more merchant ships than all Axis powers combined. For the Wehrmacht's generals, it was the return of a nightmare they could not bomb or outmaneuver. Their engineers still prized precision. America had discovered the deadlier virtue, production without pause. The war had become a contest of endurance. and the next chapter would prove how Detroit's heartbeat could shake continents. Spring 1941, Maryland's Aberdeen Proving Ground woke to the rasp of wrenches and the echo of engines under test. The air smelled of grease and sea wind drifting in from the Chesapeake, where a new shape of steel waited behind chain-link fences. It was not elegant like the British Crusader, nor monstrous like the German Panzer Waffe. It was something else entirely, a machine designed to be built, not worshipped. Engineers huddled in windbreakers around the prototype, its olive hull freshly welded, the number M4 chalked across the glacis. Beneath that armor, a 400-horsepower Continental R975 radial engine, borrowed from aircraft lineage, coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, filling the proving ground with a sound that would soon echo across 3 continents. Its 75mm M3 gun, a weapon of compromise, could break bunkers and pierce early panzers, but its true strength lay elsewhere, in repetition, in the fact that thousands more would soon bear the same gun, the same bolts, the same heartbeat. The M4 Sherman's genius was not in its firepower, but its philosophy. Its designers knew America could not afford a boutique tank war. Standardization became their creed. Every gear, tread, and turret was interchangeable. One damaged in Tunisia could be repaired with parts shipped from Ohio. Another in Sicily could borrow a gearbox built in California. Its vertical volute spring suspension offered steady ride and simple maintenance. Its welded hull replaced the slower riveted construction of its predecessors, and every line on its blueprint screamed one thing: build fast, fix easy, fight long. By mid-1942, the first Shermans clattered down British ramps in Egypt, their crews still learning their quirks under desert heat. Axis intelligence reports noted a new medium tank of surprising number. German analysts dismissed it as crude until reconnaissance revealed convoys stretching horizon to horizon, each identical, each replaceable. Where they built one Tiger, the Americans built 10 Shermans. It was not perfection that won the field. It was persistence. The M4 was not designed to dominate. It was designed to endure, to multiply, and to keep coming until resistance broke. In that single principle, mobility and manufacturability before mastery, America's war doctrine took shape, and the world's battlefields would soon tremble beneath its rhythm. November 1942, North Africa shimmered under a merciless sun as the first waves of Operation Torch struck the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. The air reeked of salt, gasoline, and cordite. The sand itself trembled with the arrival of a new kind of machine. Out of the landing craft rumbled the M4 Sherman, olive-drab armor streaked with salt spray, treads clattering against steel ramps that hissed in the surf. For American crews, many barely out of training, this was their baptism of fire. For the Germans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, it was a shock. A new enemy bringing not a few experimental machines, but columns of identical tanks that seemed to multiply with every dawn. 3 months later, at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the desert turned into a crucible. The Shermans, faster and easier to maneuver than most had expected, raced through gullies and over ridges, their 75mm guns cracking against the more formidable Panzer V's. But in the white glare of noon, the weaknesses showed. German shells sliced through their thinner armor. Some Shermans erupted in flames so hot that paint blistered into black smoke. American formations scattered, commanders struggled with coordination, and the radio nets filled with chaos. For every burned-out hull, though, another ship was already crossing the Atlantic bearing replacements. A Panzer destroyed was a loss. A Sherman destroyed was an inconvenience. German field reports noted the phenomenon with disbelief, enemy tanks appearing in waves after being decisively repulsed the day before. It was as though the desert itself produced them. In reality, the source was half a world away, where Detroit's foundries and Cleveland's presses labored day and night. Each tank that rolled off the line erased a defeat, and within months, the lessons of Kasserine were remade in steel. New M4 variants with improved radios, thicker armor, and safer wet ammunition storage. The Afrika Korps had won a tactical victory but had glimpsed a strategic nightmare. They could not destroy what America could endlessly rebuild. From the dust of North Africa rose a truth that would haunt the Axis to war's end. The real front line was not in the dunes, but in the factories that never slept. Winter 1943, Murmansk harbor lay buried under fog and sleet as cranes groaned against the weight of unfamiliar shapes. Beneath the Arctic haze, Soviet dockworkers in frost-bitten coats guided the descent of olive-drab giants, M4A2 Shermans, their hulls still bearing the markings of American factories. Diesel engines, chosen for compatibility with Soviet logistics, slept beneath their hatches, sealed in grease and salt. The journey had taken weeks through submarine-infested seas, yet over 4,100 of these machines would make it through under the Lend-Lease program, each one a piece of America's promise forged into armor. When the Red Army rolled them onto the rail lines bound for Ukraine and Belarus, the sight was surreal. Tanks made in Detroit, now steaming across frozen Soviet plains toward the same enemy that had once marched on Moscow. On the Eastern Front, where temperatures could freeze oil solid and snap steel, the Shermans performed with an unexpected resilience. German reports from the 4th Panzer Army noted with frustration that Shermans operate without fail in snow, where German engines freeze. The M4A2's diesel heart, less prone to cold seizure than the gasoline models used in the West, made it a winter workhorse. Side by side with T-34s, the Shermans formed a strange but potent alliance of engineering philosophies, American standardization meeting Soviet simplicity. To Soviet crews, they were comfortable, spacious, and reliable. To the Germans, they were an omen that industrial might was no longer confined to one front. By 1944, columns of these foreign tanks were fighting under red stars through the villages of Belarus and into Poland. German soldiers peering through binoculars now saw serial numbers from Michigan and Pennsylvania glinting beside the hammer and sickle. For Berlin, the realization was devastating. Hitler's war had awakened not one industrial rival, but a union of them. Tanks once dreamed in American design rooms were now burning in the ruins of Minsk and Smolensk, proving that the arsenal of democracy had become a weapon for the world. The flood of steel from across the oceans had erased the last illusion of parity, and as the tide of machinery rolled westward, it prepared to meet its own kind on the roads to Normandy. Autumn 1943, inside a dim room in Zossen, south of Berlin, the analysts of Fremde Heere West spread reconnaissance photos across a table scarred by years of war. Under harsh lamplight lay the evidence no one wanted to believe. Endless ranks of Sherman tanks lined up in British ports, awaiting shipment. Each gray rectangle captured from the air represented not a company or a battalion, but an ocean of replacement waiting to arrive. Field reports from North Africa and Sicily had already hinted at it, destroyed Allied tanks reappearing within weeks, but now the numbers made denial impossible. American factories were producing more than 2,500 tanks per month. Germany, by comparison, struggled to reach 400 even after diverting labor and material from civilian life. The analysts' pencils hovered uselessly over maps. No arithmetic could reverse that ratio. In the same months, Luftwaffe pilots returning from reconnaissance over Liverpool and Southampton reported acres of armor, rows so long they vanished into fog. The photos confirmed what Rommel and Kesselring had already felt in the field. The enemy's strength was not tactical but industrial. Berlin's engineers met the crisis with engineering pride and desperation, proposing thicker armor, 80mm cannons, and new super-heavy chassis. The Tiger and Panther designs emerged from that fever, each magnificent, each ruinously expensive. Hitler demanded Qualität über Masse, quality over mass, and the Reich obeyed, producing machines that devoured tungsten, fuel, and time. A Tiger I took more than 300,000 man-hours to build. Chrysler's Detroit arsenal turned out a Sherman every 38 minutes. Where German assembly remained a craft, America's had become choreography. By winter, the intelligence summaries read like surrender documents in slow motion. Reports noted enemy replenishment beyond calculation. A panzer regiment destroyed in Sicily would face its replacements, reborn, repainted, recrewed, before its own losses could be replaced. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, confided privately that the war had passed the point of tactical genius. "It is no longer decided by brilliance," he admitted, "but by arithmetic." What the Wehrmacht's officers saw unfolding was not a battle between armies, but between production lines, a war where every German innovation was already obsolete by the time the next American convoy docked. The front lines, once drawn in mud and blood, had shifted to blueprints, belts, and the pulse of industry that never slept. Spring 1941. On the flat, wind-swept outskirts of Warren, Michigan, steel skeletons rose against a gray sky. Within 6 months, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, Chrysler's answer to Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy, stood ready, a cathedral of industry spanning over 1 million square feet. Beneath its towering cranes and fluorescent glare, the future of armored warfare was already humming to life. Conveyor lines snaked across concrete floors where 22,000 workers labored in endless rotation, day and night, through snow and heat, through blackout drills and rationing. The air smelled of hot metal, oil, and paint. Sparks from welding torches fell like orange snow. Each hour, another M4 Sherman took form, its plates riveted, its gun mounted, its engine tested. By the end of its first full year, the arsenal could produce more tanks annually than the entire German war industry combined. But Detroit was not alone. Ford's Willow Run plant, originally designed for bombers, became a logistical twin of the arsenal, while Fisher Body's Grand Blanc facility added its own steady rhythm. The Midwest pulsed like a single organism, connected by railways, synchronized by radio dispatch. Flat cars rolled in from Ohio bearing hulls, while turrets arrived from Illinois, and completed machines rumbled out toward New Jersey and California ports. Women welders, the Rosies of the tank lines, took the places of men gone to Europe or the Pacific. Clad in overalls and headscarves, they turned the chaos of molten steel into precision, their arcs illuminating the factory like lightning. By 1943, U.S. factories produced over 29,000 tanks, enough to equip entire armies from scratch. Axis intelligence officers, poring over reports, dismissed the figures as propaganda until reconnaissance proved them true. Bombing raids might destroy bridges or depots, but not production speed. For every gap blasted open, another tank filled it before the smoke cleared. Across the Atlantic, German soldiers facing new waves of Shermans did not yet know that they were fighting a rhythm. One kept by engines in Detroit, by rail whistles in the night, by the thunder of assembly lines that turned industry into inevitability. The arsenal's heartbeat was already echoing toward Normandy, where its steel offspring would meet their test. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke gray and heavy over the Normandy coast, the surf foaming with wreckage and smoke. To the German 716th Infantry Division dug in above the beaches, the horizon seemed to heave and breathe, an endless line of landing craft spilling forth the machines they had once been told could never cross an ocean. Within days of the first assault, the impossible had become routine, columns of M4 Shermans clattering ashore, their olive hulls streaked with seawater and sand. Among them were the strange DD amphibious variants, their canvas skirts slick with salt, engines coughing as they rolled straight out of the tide. To the men in the bunkers, it was as though the sea itself had turned to iron. In the weeks that followed, over 6,000 Shermans reached Normandy, more armor than the Wehrmacht could field across all of France. The beaches churned under treads, fuel drums, and cranes unloading fresh vehicles even as smoke still drifted from Omaha and Juneau. Losses that would have crippled any other army, hundreds of tanks sunk, burned or bogged down, barely rippled through American logistics. Washington and Detroit did not flinch. Replacements were already steaming toward Cherbourg before the first were even buried in sand. Each Sherman's standardized parts turned chaos into efficiency. Engines could be swapped in hours, tracks replaced with spares pulled from another wreck. The tank's reliability was its hidden weapon, fuel-efficient, repairable, and predictable in a war that punished uncertainty. Against this rhythm, the vaunted German armor faltered. The Tiger and Panther roared louder, hit harder, but broke sooner. Gearboxes shattered, engines overheated, and fuel vanished faster than it could be delivered. The Allies fought not by brilliance, but by schedule, advancing mile by mile as if following a factory plan. In the bocage and fields of Normandy, the Wehrmacht learned the final, brutal equation of modern war. No tactical genius could outfight a nation that built faster than it bled. The tide that had begun in Detroit had crossed the Atlantic, and now it rolled inland, an iron flood reshaping Europe's destiny. Summer 1944, Normandy's hedgerows hid a new terror. When the first Tiger and Panther tanks rolled into the line near Villers-Bocage, their long 80-80 guns tore through Shermans like paper. American crews learned the lesson in minutes. The 75mm M3 gun that had triumphed in North Africa now could not pierce the Tiger's thick sloped armor except from the flank or rear. Shells bounced harmlessly off their fronts, leaving white scars that mocked the gunner's aim. In the cramped turrets of burning Shermans, the air filled with the stink of cordite, oil, and fear. Yet from that inferiority came something the Germans could not replicate: adaptation at industrial speed. By late 1944, the assembly lines back home had already evolved. Chrysler, Ford, and Fisher Body retooled their machines to produce the M4A3E8, the EZ8, with its new horizontal suspension and a high-velocity 76mm gun. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer joined it, its open-top turret mounting a 90mm cannon capable of knocking out a Tiger from over 1,000 yards. American factories accomplished in weeks what German engineers debated for months. The contrast was staggering. While Germany's quest for mechanical perfection slowed production to a crawl, U.S. industry turned pragmatism into strategy. Tanks that were good enough in June became deadly by December. On the battlefield, American crews learned to fight smart. They flanked, maneuvered, and called in thunderbolts and typhoons to finish what their guns could not. Platoons worked as coordinated packs rather than isolated machines, combining speed and communication into survival. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, the so-called inferior Shermans had become instruments of relentless pressure, fast, numerous, and always replaceable. The Tiger had been born to dominate. The Sherman had been built to adapt. And in a war of movement and exhaustion, it was adaptation, not invincibility, that decided who reached Berlin first. December 16, 1944, before dawn. The Ardennes lay buried beneath fresh snow, its forests muffled in silence. Then came the thunder. From the fog rose the roar of engines and the sharp crack of 88s. Hitler's final gamble had begun. The German offensive hit thin Allied lines with shocking force, Panthers and Tigers slicing through white drifts, their black crosses ghosting between pines. American units, scattered and freezing, fought blind against armor they could barely see. For a moment, it seemed as if the blitzkrieg spirit had returned, the old, terrifying precision of German speed and surprise. But behind that sudden fury waited a truth no tactic could overcome. Germany's fuel tanks were half empty, its factories shattered, its reserves already ghosts. The Wehrmacht could still attack, but it could no longer replace. The Allies could. Within days, American logistics awoke with mechanical certainty. Trains rolled from Normandy ports through the snow-choked fields of Belgium, each flat car loaded with fresh Shermans, straight from depots that drew their lifeblood from Detroit. Over 600,000 Allied troops and nearly 2,800 tanks turned to meet the assault, their replacements arriving faster than reports could be written. In Bastogne, Patton's Third Army broke through the frozen roads in a counterattack that seemed impossible, its armored columns refueled and reinforced almost daily. German commanders, watching from ridge lines, could only note with disbelief. Enemy armor replenished faster than reconnaissance can track. By January, the bulge in the Allied line had collapsed back upon the attackers. German fuel dumps burned dry, engines froze solid, and crews abandoned their immobile tanks to the snow. What shattered the offensive was not brilliance, but endurance. An economy that refused to pause. A supply chain that functioned like a second army. In those frozen forests, The truth became undeniable. Blitzkrieg's engine had changed hands. Germany had run out of time. America's factories had not. The thunder that began in Detroit was now echoing through the ruins of the Reich. March 1945. The Rhine shimmered under cold, gray skies, its swollen current carrying the wreckage of a dying empire. Along its western banks, the ground quaked with the approach of engines, thousands of them. More than 20,000 Allied tanks and armored vehicles crowded the staging grounds, their treads grinding the frozen soil into black mud. To the weary German defenders peering through shattered binoculars, the horizon seemed to move, as if the earth itself were advancing. Fuel was gone, reserves gone, communications severed. The once proud panzer divisions had become skeletons of steel and desperation. Even the appearance of the formidable King Tigers and Jagged Panthers brought no salvation. They were magnificent but few, devouring what little fuel remained just to reach the line. When the Allies crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7th, it was not just a tactical victory. It was a revelation. The Ludendorff Bridge, captured intact almost by accident, became the gateway for an army powered not by genius, but by organization. Within days, Shermans and Pershings were pouring over it in a flow so constant that German artillerymen simply stopped counting. The M26 Pershing, newly arrived from American lines, embodied the final evolution: 90mm gun, thick armor, and the same reliability that had made the Sherman immortal. It was proof that the Allies could now match Germany's best and still outproduce it tenfold. For German civilians huddled in basements, the sound of the crossing was unending, diesel engines rumbling like an approaching storm that never passed. Streets that had once celebrated Blitzkrieg now trembled beneath foreign tracks. The symbolism was unmistakable. Where the Panzer had once defined modern war, the assembly line had inherited its crown. Each bridge captured, each road cleared, was more than a maneuver. It was the triumph of system over spectacle, of relentless tempo over fading myth. The Rhine had been the last barrier. Now it carried only the echo of inevitability. May 1945. The guns fell silent, and from the ruins of Berlin to the workshops of Detroit, the true shape of victory came into focus. It was not the tank aces or the generals who had determined the outcome, but the machinery behind them, the furnaces, the presses, the workers who had turned blueprints into power. America had not merely fought with tanks. It had fought with factories. The same assembly lines that once rolled out sedans and tractors had become engines of conquest, their rhythms steady and unbroken even as continents burned. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced more armored vehicles than Germany. Italy and Japan combined, tens of thousands of Shermans, Grants and Pershings, each one a moving testament to what organized industry could accomplish when bound to national will. Every bolt and gearbox carried an idea more potent than any doctrine: endurance over elegance. Germany had pursued perfection, Tigers with their intricate transmissions, Panthers with their finely machined guns, but every masterpiece came at the price of time. America pursued sufficiency multiplied by scale. The result was unstoppable. For every Tiger that limped to the front, 5 Shermans were already crossing the channel. The war had become an equation of stamina, and in that equation, efficiency had triumphed over artistry. When peace came, the great arsenals, Detroit, Grand Blanc, Lima, fell quiet. Their lines shuttered, but their legacy intact. The principles they had proven, mass production, modular repair, interchangeable design, became the foundation of all wars to come, from the frozen hills of Korea to the missile fields of the Cold War. The Wehrmacht had once dismissed America's machines as crude and common. In the end, those machines had defined a new age. The myth of invincible armor died in the rubble of Europe. What endured was something far greater: the realization that in modern war, the mightiest weapon is the factory itself. Spring 1945. The rumble of engines that once shook Europe began to fade, but their echo lingered in every liberated city and on every scarred road. The tanks that crossed the Rhine and rolled through the ruins of the Reich were more than weapons of steel and fire. They were the living proof of what a free industrial nation could summon when tested. Each Sherman that clattered into victory carried 1,000 unseen hands, the welder in Detroit whose sparks lit its seams, the machinist in Pittsburgh who cut its gears, the truck driver in Alabama who hauled its engine through the night. Their labor had moved across oceans and continents, turning factories into front lines and workers into silent soldiers. For the men who rode those machines, triumph was not only measured in miles gained, but in the heartbeat of an engine that never quit. To the shattered Wehrmacht, the truth came with final clarity. Strategy could win battles, but only machinery could win wars. When the factories finally fell silent in 1945, they left behind no marble monument, yet their legacy was louder than any anthem, the rhythm of motion itself. The arsenal of democracy had built more than tanks. It had built time, momentum, and inevitability. And as history advanced into a new age of mechanized power, that hum, the steady pulse of production turned to purpose, remained the sound of victory.